Welcome to our study of the final section of the book of Daniel. My name is Bob Pulliam and I am the evangelist for the Charlotte Church of Christ, which meets at 5327 South Tryon Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. When we take in this final section, we're actually studying 3 chapters from this book. Previously, we've taken it a chapter at a time, but the last vision in the book of Daniel really covers all 3 chapters, and we need to take it all together. So I'll be dividing this video in half. Hopefully it'll be as in half as possible, and I'll try to keep it down to 20 to 25 minutes at the most for each part of the video. The majority of the vision, the information in the vision, actually comes in chapter 11. We have an introduction in chapter 10 that gives us the picture of how the vision comes to Daniel and when it comes to Daniel. Chapter 11 then gives us a great deal of information about coming events. And then in chapter 12, we get down to the conclusion of the vision where everything is going to be wrapped up. Now, we're told here in chapter 10 and verse 1 that this takes place in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And that places us at 556 BC. And this gives me a good opportunity to introduce my date meter up here, as I call it. And it's going to be moving during the course of this study to reflect when the fulfillment of the prophecy would take place. So right now I've set it to where Daniel is as he is receiving this information from this heavenly being. And as we go along, you'll see that meter jump ahead to the Grecian Empire and then move through the prophecies that are going on here. And I'm really doing that for a very important reason, and that is that as we see the history unfold as prophecy is fulfilled, we see it doing so a portion at a time. And it's nothing that's jumping a long way. It may jump 50 or so years at a time in order to get to the next event, because Daniel is not providing a history book. This is about prophecy of events that are leading up to something, leading up to 2 somethings really. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. But these things are happening in reasoned steps, and we're going to see that as we go along in this particular video. Now, the chapter 10 has a lot of interesting detail in it, and some of the times people want to go into chapter 10 and they want to tell us what everything represents. For example, here in verse 6 of Daniel 10, we read about this being who comes to deliver this message to Daniel, and his body was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. Now, some of the times people will come in here and they'll want to interpret this by telling us what each of these details about his appearance, what each of these details represent. This heavenly being is not the statue of chapter 2, where each part necessarily represents something. Why can't we look at the heavenly being and see him for who he is? He is a heavenly being. And I believe the point that we're supposed to take away from this is that this is a divine message. When we see Daniel's reaction to this isn't just anyone. This isn't someone you would meet on the street. This isn't one of the other prophets. This is someone sent from God for this purpose. And as we read the details of chapter 11, and Daniel is contemplating the things that will come to pass, and later the Jews will be reading Daniel and they'll be told that this is what's going to happen. They need to know where the information came from. And where the information came from is truly very impressive. And that is so important here. Now, an important detail from chapter 10 that I think we should point out is the fact that these things would take place in the latter days. If you drop down to verse 14 in chapter 10, we read here, "Now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the days yet future." Daniel chapter 8 verses 17 through 19 said that Persia and Greece will be at the time of the end. And a lot of times people don't take these phrases in their correct context. They think that it's the end from when we live. And it's an end or a latter day from when Daniel was receiving the message. I get comments from people who want to make these end times something that is in the future, and they talk about Britain being the lion, the bear in chapter 8 is Greece, and we have all of these guesses, the bear is Russia, and we have all of these guesses about these things. We get the UN in here, we start talking about nations that are right now, and this is not about nations that exist right now. This begins with Persia and Greece, and it's going to talk about events that are latter days from the days of Daniel. When we go to Daniel chapter 2 and verse 28, we have a similar statement that's made. And Daniel here is being told with regard to the Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the great statue. He has been told, and he is telling Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. Well, what were the latter days? Well, the vision goes as far as the Grecian Empire and the Roman Empire, and then in verse 44, in the days of those kings. And you know what people want to do today when they interpret that? They want to say, oh, well, this is about something off in the future. The Roman Empire is going to be revived. That vision does not give you leave to jump this off into the future and divide the Roman Empire up into something else. There's nothing in that vision to indicate that. And there's nothing in this vision to tell us that it is way off in the future or in even our near future, as end times theologians today will typically tell you. How many end times theologians do you listen to today who tell you that this is another 2,000 years away? They won't tell you that. They'll tell you it's right on the horizon. It's about to happen. It's going to take place. Open your newspaper and read your newspaper. In fact, a very well-known and respected end times theologian, his name is Dr. David Jeremiah, he will specifically tell you that you cannot interpret prophecy without your newspaper open. Well, guess what? That's what people have been doing ever since newspapers were invented, and they've gotten it wrong the whole time. And so what makes us think that we're going to get it right? Now, I will probably repeat this at some point during this study later on, but I do want to point out that historians do not sit down to record history for the purpose of telling us what Daniel meant in prophecies. We know that, but we forget that as we're reading Daniel and someone comes along and they say, oh, well, this verse, it says this, and we can't find anything in history that is related to that prophesies about. Really? You know what I told you first, but now you're denying what I told you. I told you historians didn't record history for this, so why do we expect for history to include all of the details in Daniel chapter 11? You say, well, God would have put it in providentially. Really? Now you're telling how God ought to operate things. Truth of the matter is that as Jews read chapter 11, they would have been able to see these things. Whether anybody ever wrote something down or not. Let me read a quote for you from Josephus. This is from Antiquities of the Jews. It's book 10, chapter 11, and paragraph 7. Antiquities of the Jews, and here Josephus is talking about Daniel chapter 11 and chapters 8 through 12 actually, and he here speaks of Daniel and says, the various books that he wrote and left behind him are still read by us till this time. And from them we believe that Daniel conversed with God, for he did not only prophesy of future events, as did the other prophets, but he also determined the time of their accomplishment. The other prophets, for the most part, did not do that. Isaiah mentioned Cyrus, but Daniel, he goes in and in this place in particular, he gives us a timeline. Just as I'm going to show you the dates on the meter above, he gives us a timeline. So that's very important for us to keep in mind. So we get down to the end of chapter 10, and we read about the Prince of Persia, and we read about the Prince of Greece is coming, and of course we know that Persia is going to be conquered by Greece. And so the whole thing is set up in our mind, and we need to go on into chapter 11 with that understanding. And so now let's look at chapter 11, and we read here in verse 2 that 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. And I give these to you in a chart on my left here. I've not listed all of the kings, but I just want to point out that there were a number of kings still to come. And the point here is not that 3 kings are coming, then the fourth king comes, and then Persia falls. He doesn't say that. Read that verse very carefully. It simply says that that 4th king, he is going to arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And that is exactly what happens. And so from that point forward, Persia is going to be pushing up against Greece and provoking Greece. In fact, in the days of Alexander the Great, when he does invade Greece and conquer Greece, this was a part of the PR campaign to sell this whole thing to his nation, that we need to go and we need to do this. We need to avenge this battle. And so they go in and they conquer the Persians. In verse 3, we read about a mighty king who is going to arise. This mighty king is Alexander the Great. He's actually born in 356 BC. So I changed the date meter up here. And now we're going to begin to work our way through the Grecian Empire. Now Alexander, he died in 323. He's conquered the world, and the world was his oyster, but now he's dead. He can't do anything with it, and we find that his kingdom was parceled out. There were quite a number of players in that process, but it actually all distilled down to 4 players when all was said and done. And when the dust had settled, we had 4 parts. You may remember this from our study of chapter 8. And so we read in chapter 8 and verse 8, as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. In its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Well, here in verse 4 of Daniel chapter 11, we also see that it is parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. And so we have our 4 players that we talked about previously, that the kingdom of Greece is divided up into these 4 parts. Now in verse 5, we begin to learn about the king of the north and the king of the south. In chapter 8, we also learned about the 2 dominant portions here. The king of the north and the king of the south. We learned that the king of the north was the Seleucids. It wasn't one specific king. It was a process of kings, or a kingdom. Then we have the king of the south, and that is the Ptolemies. And in this text, in verse 5 of chapter 11, as they're known as the king of the north and the king of the south, the kings change over the course of the text, but the power is always a struggle between these 2 kingdoms. Here in verse 5, the king of the south is actually Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the First. And the prince that is mentioned here is Seleucus the First. Now in 316 BC, Seleucus the First, he actually defected from the north, from the Seleucids, and he defected down to the south. In verse 6, we have a very interesting series of events that take place. It's a little confusing, so let me put this out in graphics for you. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. And what this was a marriage alliance. And Ptolemy II is on the throne in the south, and Antiochus II is on the throne in the north. Even though Antiochus was already married to a woman named Laodice, he has a child by her, even though he's already married, Ptolemy II, the king of the south, he pressured Antiochus to divorce Laodice in order to marry his daughter, Berenice. And this marriage alliance, it took place in 252 BC. Later, when Ptolemy died in the south, Antiochus, he divorced Berenice, the daughter that he had taken in marriage, and he took Laodice back. Well, then Laodice, she poisoned Antiochus. She's not going to have that happen to her again. She poisoned Antiochus, and even more than that, she had to get rid of Berenice and the child that Antiochus and she had, because Laodice has a son named Seleucus Callinicus, and she wanted him on the throne. And so in 246 BC, we find Seleucus Callinicus taking the throne in the north. Now, after Seleucus's mother, Laodice, had poisoned Berenice, remember, she was the daughter of the king of the south. Well, the king of the south dies, and Berenice's brother, Ptolemy Euergetes, he takes the throne. And Berenice's brother, Ptolemy Euergetes, he is going to exact revenge. So he brings forces up, he amasses an army, and he attacks the king of the north. And this takes place in 248 BC. So Ptolemy in the south is victorious, and remember that this is Egypt. Egypt is victorious over Syria. He returns home to a peaceful reign. Aside from skirmishes here and there, things are peaceful internally. Now in verse 9, Seleucus II, he did make an attempt to go back and to regain against Ptolemy III this time, but he failed in so doing. Now in verse 10, we read that his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces. Well, Seleucus II, remember that's the son of Laodice, Seleucus II had three sons. All three of them actually end up ruling in the north at various times. These three sons were Seleucus III, Antiochus III, and Seleucus IV. Now, it's Antiochus here in verse 10, Antiochus II, who attacks the king of the south here in verse 10. And when we look at verse 11, we find Ptolemy IV, he's Ptolemy Philopater, he's on the throne, and history tells us that he is going to come against the king of the north. He takes 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry into battle, and this is known in history as the Battle of Raphia. It was fought in 217 BC, and Antiochus in the north was defeated by Ptolemy, the king of the south. Now, even though Ptolemy's success was great, it was fleeting. He didn't work hard to keep his victories, and so in verse 12 we end that verse with, "Yet he will not prevail." And so true to history, prophecy gives us the picture in advance. In verse 14, we read that there will be a rising, notice that the violent ones among your people, which he's speaking to Daniel, so that would be the Jews. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Now there was an effort by Jews to help Antiochus III break the power of the Ptolemies in Palestine. They succeeded, but it had a tragic result. The result was that it ended up giving his successor, Antiochus Epiphanes, the rule. This is fulfilled at the Battle of Panium in 198 BC. And so eventually this other player that we haven't gotten to yet is going to come to the throne. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. And so what the Jews have done in helping who should have been a foe is that they have facilitated the rise of someone who's truly going to be terrible. In verse 15, we read about a well-fortified city captured. This would seem to be the city of Sidon, which is taken by Antiochus III in 197 BC. In verse 16, we read about the Seleucids, who are now going to keep Palestine until the Romans come along and they end up taking it away from them. Now in verse 17, we find a proposal of peace, which is put into effect, giving him the daughter of women. This is an incident where Antiochus betrothed his daughter to Ptolemy V. Now, Ptolemy V was just a child at the time of the betrothal. The marriage arrangement, this did not work out as hoped. And so that is reflected here in verse 17. And by the way, the Ptolemy V, if you know about the Rosetta Stone, Ptolemy V is the subject of the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is the way that it facilitated the decoding of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Up until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, linguists were having a terrible time trying to get a handle on hieroglyphs. Well, the Rosetta Stone was written in 3 languages, and one was the hieroglyphics of Egypt, and it enabled them to get a handle on that and to be able to interpret this. And so after the events of 197 to 192 BC, we have the Romans in verse 18 putting a stop to the spread of Antiochus, and this would have been in 191 to 190. The Romans put their foot down and they wouldn't let Antiochus go any further. And so in verse 19, Antiochus, he lost extensive territories and never really recovered from that. Well, I'm going to break this video right here. I hope to see you on the other side in part 2 of this video, and hope that so far that this has been helpful to you in understanding what's going on in this prophecy in Daniel chapter 11.